Well, welcome to another Wednesday night online Bible study. I am thrilled that you're joining us tonight. Whether it's your first time or you've joined us many times before, don't forget you can always submit questions about the Bible study. You can do that in the comments below or email us at info@dallasbaychurch.com. And if you still have a question about one of our older lessons, maybe you still need to go back and catch one of our older lessons, you can always do that. They are made available right where you're watching this one, whether it's the website, Facebook, or YouTube. But tonight, I'm really excited about this lesson and about who is going to be teaching it. He is an excellent teacher. He's been teaching here at Dallas Bay in one of our adult Bible study classes for quite a while now. He is a pro, and I know that you are going to get a lot from specifically this lesson tonight from tonight's teacher, Randy Ballard.
Well, thank you for joining us tonight. We're going to be looking at a passage in the book of Ezekiel. I was doing my personal devotions there, and I ran across a verse that I've seen before, but decided I wanted to stay and look at it a little more. And while the passage in Ezekiel, we're not going to be talking about that, I just want to give you a little background. Ezekiel is writing to those people, the Jews that have been captured and brought to Babylon, or those that are still in Judea and Jerusalem, and he's telling them that God is going to bring judgment on them. Already Nebuchadnezzar, as either the general or the king of Babylon, has descended on Jerusalem, and in 605 he took captives such as Daniel, and then in 597 he took Ezekiel and some of the others. But here Ezekiel is saying that God is sending this judgment because of their adultery and their rejection of him, and because they're trying to cover all their bases. They're looking at other gods, and they're trying to be partially for the Jehovah and worship him, but also trying to burn incense and other things to other gods. And so he's telling them that there should not be compromise and that judgment's coming. So I want you to look, if you have your Bibles, turn, if you will, to Ezekiel chapter 14. Ezekiel chapter 14. And I'm going to start in verse 12. It says, "The word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, if a country sins against me by being unfaithful, and I stretch out my hand against it to cut off its food supply and send famine upon it and kill its men and their animals, even if these three men, Noah, Daniel, and Job, were in it, they could save only themselves and their righteousness, declares the sovereign Lord." Now he's going to go on and he's going to make this example. He's going to talk about famine. He's going to talk about the sword. He's going to talk about wild beast and plague that God is going to send, which is typical when you have war, something happens. He says that not any of those times these three men could save anyone else. And I just thought, why would he pick these three men? Why not Moses and David or Samuel or other examples in the Old Testament? Why Noah? Why Daniel? Why Job? And as I began to ponder that and look in the scriptures at what it says about them, I've come up with some items that I believe would help us to understand that. Those events, I've alliterated them with the letter C to help me remember and hopefully to help you as well. One of the first things I want you to understand when you talk about Noah, Daniel, and Job is these men all three had unusual circumstances. Noah lived in a time of extreme wickedness. In fact, the scriptures tell us in Genesis 6 that the thoughts of their thoughts in their heart was continually evil. It says they were wicked men, and usually in the Old Testament when you see the word wicked, it means that people know to do right, but they just willingly choose to do wrong. And it says that was that point, and God grieved in his heart that he had created man, and he's going to start all over. And so Noah lived in really difficult times. You have Daniel, who was a captive, as already mentioned, and went to Babylon. He probably was emasculated, and then he was immersed in the culture of the Babylonians. He had to learn all of their literature, their language, their philosophy, but also the mysticism, the spiriticism, and all of the idolatry there. And for a Jew, this would have been abhorrent. And yet we find that Daniel was one of these people that never compromised. And of course, Job, he starts off in chapter 1 of the book of Job. He's fantastic. He's well known, he's rich, he has all of these things going for him. And then suddenly God says, have you considered my servant Job to Satan? And things begin to change. He loses all of his children, he loses all of his wealth, and he loses his health. He's covered with sores from head to toe. And his wife, it's going to be so bad that she's going to say, curse God and die. And yet it says that Job was this man that was principled and carried on. I thought it was interesting that not only did they have circumstances were there, but it was about the consciousness that they had. When I began to study these scriptures and to look at them, I realized that these people had a great relationship with God. They're living in circumstances that are, unbelievable, but they lived in a relationship with God. And in Proverbs chapter 1 and verse 7, it says, the beginning of wisdom is the fear of the Lord. It's not that it's something that we quake and shake, afraid he's going to hit us with a lightning bolt. It is this idea that they had a constant awareness of what God is doing, a constant awareness of who he is. Hebrews 11:6 says, without faith, it is impossible to please God. For those who would come to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek for him. And the real key to that verse is the fact is that without faith, obviously, but it's he is. When we understand who God is, it changes whatever our circumstances are and where we are. Many of you probably remember Gina Patterson here, and Gina was afflicted with an ailment and eventually died from that. But if you ever saw Gina from the time that she was diagnosed up until near her death, you could never escape the fact that Gina was changed. The grace of God was on her life. And she came out of that with a ministry and a commission that God did. And when I look at these men, they were given a commission by God. They were callable. He was able to take them and say, hey, I've got a job for you, even in these vile circumstances. Noah's job was to build an ark and to be a preacher of righteousness according to 2 Peter. It said that he preached there, and then the implication is in 1 Peter that Jesus witnessed to them, but I think it's personally through Noah as he was preaching all that time. And with every nail that Noah drove into the ark, with every board that he sawed, with everything that he did, that was a witness that he was telling the world that's coming. And remember, this was a time when it says there was no rain on the earth, that the earth was watered through a mist. Daniel was this guy, like I said, that was brought and immersed in Babylonian culture, and yet he distinguished himself as someone different. He had Nebuchadnezzar saying, you've got the spirit of the gods, but it wasn't the gods, it was the God. And Daniel, when he had a chance to speak before Nebuchadnezzar, when he interpreted his visions, when he told him the future that was going to happen in the Gentile world, he would tell him there is a God in heaven who determines these things. It is a God in heaven that does that. And it was their understanding. Job is going to look at that and say, even though if God slays me, he says, I will trust in him. There was this measured consciousness that they had. And then we find out they're men of prayer. Daniel, obviously, you've heard the story of the lion's den, but it was Daniel's custom 3 times a day to pray. I personally think he did it at the time of the morning sacrifice, at noon, and at the time of the evening sacrifice. We don't know if that's really correct or not, but it was Daniel saying, hey, God, I'm going to serve you each and every day. And when you're watching me and recording everything that I'm doing and judging it, God, I'm going to live in the fear of you, and it's going to change my life. Well, it went on about this, and then we have not only that, but we have this commitment. Daniel is going to be a politician, so to speak. He's going to rise to prime minister. They hated him. And yet we find out that it says that his enemies, when they were trying to get rid of Daniel, is that they looked for something they could bring against him, and they couldn't find anything. There was no corruption. There was nothing. In this day and age, and the stories that's going on all the time about corruption, that's amazing. Here was this guy, and they said, the only thing we can do is to find some way to attack him is through his God. And so they came up with some grand story about how nobody could pray except to the king. But Daniel, he said, I've got something to live for rather than something to die for. And he continued to pray. And that's how he ended up in the lion's den. And he got out. We know that Job prayed for his children all the time. Noah walked with God. And so we have these people that lived this life that had this great commitment. But I think the most important thing that we know as we close this thing out, we look to the last C, was their character. And it's not what they said about themselves, it's what God said about them. It said that Noah was a righteous man and that he walked with God and that he was blameless among the society that he lived in. His life was a living testimony of what God has done. Daniel had the angel Gabriel and another angel, which was probably Gabriel, might have visited, doesn't say his name, but that angel said, Daniel, you're highly beloved. You're greatly esteemed. And that's what God is saying about this person. And of course, Job, he tells Satan, he said, have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on the earth like him. He fears God, and he's upright in all of his dealings. You know, as I look at this passage and I thought about these three great men, I know that all of us are in some kind of circumstance. I had a friend of mine who said that we're going into a trial or we're coming out of a trial or we just finished one. And he said, you know, those things happen in our lives. But when they do, where do we turn? Where do we look? Are you conscious of God's movement in your life? Are you aware of being committed to him? I just read a report just a few days ago, which to me was very disturbing. And in that report, it said in the United States that only 4% of adults at 30 years of age or under would truly be called committed to God. It said they may go to church, but the real reality of it is that church doesn't have a whole lot of impact on their life. It's something they think it's a good thing to do, but they don't read their Bible, they don't pray, they don't follow through, they don't get involved, they just attend. And people, if that's true of our lives, it's clear to why Jesus said that we're going to go back to the days of Noah. And when people are unaware and never heard the message and never understood what's coming about. I ask you, what is your circumstances? What is God calling you to do? What is he gifted and graced you with? If you're a child of his, he's given you certain gifts and talents and abilities to use. Is he going to say, well done, my good and faithful servant, come in here and be with me? Or is he going to look at you and say, you're a wicked servant because you did not follow through? You know, what would God say about your character? He is watching all the time. What do you do when nobody else is watching? They say that's another example of character. And so I encourage you, take time, look at this word. I hope that I've just whetted your appetite so that you'll go back and look at these scriptures in Genesis 6 and in Daniel, the whole book. There's only 12 chapters there. Read Job chapter 1 and 2 and go on over to the end of it and read the story there. So as we look at these scriptures in there, why is it that God chose these three men? It's because they were unique individuals in a unique time for a unique cause. And I think God is saying that about us, our church, our country, our world. It's time that we turn to God and look to him.